I just want to say the ultimate convergence of old Lawfare and new Lawfare happened last night when Jim Comey shared on Instagram Taylor Swift's endorsement of Kamala Harris. Because, you know, there's like the Jim Comey side of Lawfare, and then there's the new Lawfare people who are hardcore Swifties. And so there it was, a harmonic convergence.
I'm very intrigued what the next home Chiefs game is going to be like, because I'm guessing that Chiefs fans are not necessarily swayed by Swift's politics, but will their admiration for her side hustle love boy make up for her politics for a lot of those Chief fans? I don't know. That's the news I'm ready for.
I mean, I gotta say, I think there's like, it would take a lot of people by surprise 2 years ago to tell them that in the great national divorce that we're going through, the left gets the NFL.
It's pretty wild. Pretty exciting as a football fan, I will say. And you forgot the key part of the convergence of the Taylor Swift event, which is that her message was half about AI and misinformation.
Right. I mean, look, Taylor Swift is kind of taking over Lawfare. She has a set of concerts canceled because of terrorist threats from ISIS. And then she has an AI controversy.
There's only one place to go from here.
Yeah, Swift, consider this a formal invite. We're ready for you. Come on the podcast. Let's talk about these national security issues.
That's the only place we can go. Hey, we'll give you a full 90 minutes, not just our 1 hour. We'll go for the full 90 on this one. We only do that for the most special of guests. But for you, Taylor, anything. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am your regular co-host, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to be welcoming you to this new chapter in Rational Security history, where, for those who may not have listened last week, we are kicking the doors open to our full range of Lawfare colleagues and contributors who will now be coming on the show on a more regular basis, along with Alan and Quinta and a couple of our old friends. We're thrilled to have several of our recurring guests and friends and members of the Lawfare family on the podcast, including co-host emeritus Benjamin Wittes.
Yo.
Lawfare's fellow in technology policy and law, Eugenia Lostri. Eugenia, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. The first episode of this new chapter.
Absolutely. We're calling this RatSec 2.1, I think, is how we're going to do. It's a pretty small step from what it was before, but, you know, we got to keep the numbering system going a little bit here.
Still excited to be here.
Still exciting. You know, that point one, that's a big jump. That's a tenth of a way to a whole new model of rational security. And of course, we could not be more thrilled to have our most recent addition, Kevin Frazier, the Tarbell Fellow at Lawfare. Kevin, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Howdy. Always a pleasure and thrilled to start off this new chapter. Although an AI naming schematic would suggest this should be like Rational Security 2.0 or something that makes no sense to anyone else. But I guess we can go with 2.1.
This is Rational Security Gerard edition, I think. We're just going to go through the whole range of possible men's names, Claude, whatever else we can get in there. I am thrilled to have you three with us to talk over a couple of the big national security stories from this past week, because as always, it has been a big week. And we've got some kind of unique stories to talk about that we want to dig into in some unique topics. For our first topic today, I have concepts of a segment topic. Last night, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump faced off in what might end up being the only presidential debate between the two candidates in the 2024 election. What did it tell us about how national security is figuring into the election? And topic 2, running political interference. The Justice Department has been very busy these past few weeks, bringing an array of indictments and enforcement actions against various Russian actors and their proxies for spreading misinformation, surreptitiously funding political commentary, and otherwise attempting to interfere in the upcoming 2024 elections. What explains the sudden wave of activity so close to the election, and what threats are still hanging out there? And topic 3, never forgot. 23 years have passed since the unprecedented terrorist attacks of 9/11. In many ways, they redefined the trajectory of U.S. national security policy and politics for decades, but today the United States has shifted focus to a very different set of challenges. What is the ongoing legacy of 9/11 more than 2 decades after the attacks? So let's start with our first topic here and talk about the debates last night. We are, of course, a national security podcast. We're not going to open with a kind of general political commentary of the debates, but the debates had a lot of national security content. And in particular, they had a lot of discussion about national security topics, foreign policy topics, and frankly, a lot of national security being invoked for a lot of different ways, references to military officers and their impressions of former President Trump, something Kamala Harris referenced repeatedly, sense about the way world leaders perceive President Biden and Vice President Harris, something former President Trump referenced repeatedly, and vice versa. Vice President Harris mentioned that as well in regards to Trump. So national security is woven throughout these debates and in a lot of ways throughout these elections. And we think it's worth spending a little time talking about what we pulled out of the debate. Kevin, let me start with you on this one. So as someone who cares about national security, how do you watch the debates? What are you looking for? How much of it is about substance? How much of it is about other topics? And what kind of jumped out at you at this particular debate that we saw last night?
Yeah, I think I'll have to be honest and say that if you're watching debates for substance, then you're probably watching the wrong show. I watch debates more so for vibes, and I think there were a lot of vibes that were very strong in the debate last night. And so that's really what I was focused on in terms of what is the general themes that we could anticipate from one administration or the other, and not necessarily what can we expect in the first 100 days. So some of those explicit themes that really came to the fore for me was looking at the very anti-China stance of both Trump and Harris, and there seemed to be a little competition of racing to see who could be the most aggressive against China. So obviously, I take a bit of an AI perspective to these national security questions, given my scholarship focus. And what was fascinating to me was the two of them battling to say, how are we going to make sure that the U.S. wins the AI competition? And they could have just ended there and said, who's going to win this competition? But they also said, we need to make sure we beat China. And I think that emphasis and that framing was really telling to me that a lot of AI policy, where it intersects with national security, I think under both administrations is going to be framed as, well, what is China doing and how do we keep our advantage over China? And so that was something that stuck out to me. Otherwise, I think it's those vibes that I really look for, but I'm keen to hear what other folks have to say.
Ben, Eugenia, I'm curious about this as well. So this is a topic where we saw a lot of commonality, like both candidates kind of rowing in the same direction, if not exactly at the same pace on China and AI and competition in particular. But were there other topics where you jumped out, you saw a much harder split, or other topics where you saw sort of commonality? What kind of jumped out at you as highlights? Eugenia, let me start with you.
Sure. Let me just say that as, similar to Kevin, I also watched the debate mostly for vibes and less for the substance, and I think that was the correct approach. I wasn't really sure what to expect, especially after the previous debate. At least we got a little bit more out of this one, I think. In terms of AI and China, there is the commonality. I guess I wonder about the questions about chip manufacturing, about, bringing manufacturing back to the US, what that's going to look like, if that's feasible, if that's realistic, if that's the best way to go about it. I think Kevin probably has better thoughts on that than I do, but I wonder, how much of that is realistic as we look to the next administration, whichever one it is. Now, in terms of what was different, and maybe in the middle ground, when they were talking about Ukraine, right, both of them talked about the need for the conflict to end, but they talked about ending it in very different ways, right? Former President Trump talked about just calling both of them because he can call anyone and he will just end it before he even takes over, as he, if he were to be elected as president-elect, he would just solve it. And Harris's response to that was, well, that's just because you would give it up. And our approach to finishing the conflict is not to give in to Russia and to give in to their demands, but rather to support Ukraine. And I think that was an interesting way in which they're both talking about ultimately the same outcome, but in very different ways.
So I'm surprised that neither Kevin nor Eugenia mentioned the incredibly sophisticated cybersecurity discussion on the part of the candidates, and the nuanced discussions about what will happen in the next 702 renewal process, and of course the extended exchange about undersea cables. And I really am just surprised that made so little impression on my colleagues.
Well, Ben, it was just so clear during the conversation that what's the point of bringing it up?
And, to be honest, if there had been robust discussion of undersea cables, the drinking game I was playing, I wouldn't have woken up today, right? The undersea cables mentioned was like 4 shots minimum.
Right. No, I mean, so on the one hand, it is very easy to make fun of the substanceless component of this debate because Kamala Harris was largely not answering questions. She was making and very skillfully, by the way, making pre-imagined introductions to herself, and Donald Trump was going on deranged rants. And so it's easy to, say, as both Eugenia and Kevin did, I watched it for the vibes, or even just to sort of dismiss the idea that there's any substance to it at all. That said, I mean, jokes aside, I actually think there is a profound national security component to this debate. The debate was, in fact, dominated by national security issues, with the solitary exception of periodic discussions of inflation and the economy in some diffuse, ethereal sense, and a single protracted discussion of reproductive rights. The rest of it was all about stuff that we would talk about on Lawfare. But it doesn't present as national security issues because they actually talk about it in terms of other things. If you break down the vision that Donald Trump is describing, first of all, it is completely dominated by a sense of invasion from foreign actors through the border that colors the way he sees everything else. And he is obsessed with supposed weakness on the part of our leadership in the face of foreign, sometimes he says, take advantage of us, exploiting us. And that's the way he talks about Russia. It's the way he talks about China. It's the way he talks about trade in general. He thinks of it in this sort of apocalyptic national security terms. And so I think Donald Trump's vision, and I do think it is a vision. It's seldom articulated as a cohesive vision, but if you put all these themes together, there really is a national security vision there, and it's about the exploitation, cheating, and invasion of the United States by a diverse array of foreign actors, and the allowing of that to happen by weak American leadership. That's one vision. And then you have a Kamala Harris national security vision, which you might summarize as something like the Venn diagram overlap of the sort of center, the blob, right? The two-party consensus national security views over a long period of time. So yes, the border is an issue, but it's not an overriding, dominant, apocalyptic problem. It's a policy problem that needs to be dealt with. There is great power competition, but we have allies that we are working with, and we are importantly supporting those allies. And it is important for the United States to be a responsible actor, player in the world, so that we can do things effectively. And when she talks about national security issues, there are things like chips, there are things like supporting Ukraine so that Ukraine wins as opposed to, stopping the war. There are things like a kind of traditional bipartisan pro-Israel attitude with respect to Iran, combined with a solicitude for Palestinian aspirations, right? I mean, there's if you think about the conventional bipartisan national security vision, that's the vision that she's largely representing last night. And so I think actually, if you measure it in the number of minutes spoken by both candidates, national security just dominated that debate. It's just didn't do it with using the words national security.
Something that stood out as we were watching the debate was Donald Trump kept talking about nuclear weapons as part of, the threat, which I think feeds into this apocalyptic vision of the future that he has. Do you think that is a real concern? It's a real concern for him, even though it might not be a real concern? Or is it part of kind of a narrative that he's trying to communicate about it, like how terrible things are going to be unless he comes back?
So I do think that there's an element of both in there. He has a rhetorical, they're going to destroy everything approach that is, they were the worst at this. I built the best economy. They were the weakest. But I also think there's a element of it that reflects a kind of extreme version of the caution that has led the Biden administration, say, to be less assiduous and quick about approving weapons transfers to the Ukrainians, right? There is the Biden administration's policy in Ukraine can be described as, help Ukraine win without destroying the world, right? And the without destroying the world part does seem to dominate Trump's thinking, and he doesn't care about letting Ukraine win. And so that part, the fact that Russia is a nuclear power and that this could escalate, clearly weighs on him in a way that I religiously try to avoid psychoanalyzing Donald Trump because I just don't want to spend time in his head. Whether that's just a excuse for giving Vladimir Putin what he wants, or whether it's driving his desire to let Putin eat up Ukraine, I really don't know, and I don't want to speculate about. But I think it's a factor that he talks about on a fairly continuous basis.
I think there's a really interesting way to think about this, which is, the classic statement, the classic kind of conventional wisdom is foreign policy doesn't matter for elections. And you look at people self-reporting what they're interested in, it rarely rises that high. Immigration does, is like the one issue that does, but other foreign policy issues really don't. Occasionally, terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan has popped up during particular moments over the last 20, 25 years, but relatively rarely. They don't want to stick there that often. But it is this perennial theme in all these debates and all of our narratives about the presidency. And I think that has to do a lot with the fact that it has this relationship to the virtues we look for in a president. Issues about national security are seen as the biggest tests for judgment, temperament, general vision, assignments of values in a lot of ways that are kind of the preconcepts that lead into a policy. They're the more foundational aspects of a person and their agenda that we actually look at to a little bit, because whatever people say about policy and commitments and campaigns, very few of them actually, survive contact with the enemy. Very few of them actually see realization. Really, what we're trying to get is these more fundamental values and capacity questions. Let me actually come to you on that, Kevin, because I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. How does those meta questions, those narrative questions, suffer last night or deal last night? We saw the first debate have that be the dominant thing. What people said, Trump and Biden said that first debate, did not matter. The takeaway was that people were worried Biden wasn't competent to stand as a candidate and as president, or at least weren't enough people were to eventually lead the Democrats to pursue a different candidate. What were the big meta narratives out of last night? What did you take away on those broader foundational questions?
Yeah, and I do think to Ben's point, what's really important is seeing how pervasive national security was, and even seeing, arguably in those side inflation conversations and economy conversations, there was always a nexus with national security, right? We got back to tariffs. We got back to trade policy with China. And so just how pervasive it is, I think for me, a big thing coming out of this debate is now that we're a little more stable, we know who the two candidates will certainly be, and there's no questions about that. What are we going to see from the personnel and what comes next, right? Who are the potential people we could see make up this administration? Because I'm a big believer in personnel as policy. And so getting a better sense of who's actually going to staff some of these administrations, I think, is going to be a really important inquiry going forward. The other meta-narrative, though, that seems to be pervasive, especially across the left, I'd say, media sphere, would be, this was a prime example of Harris, and I feel like if I had a nickel for every time I saw this headline this morning, Harris baited Trump. Harris set the trap and Trump fell into it. So I really do think, as Ben was pointing out, this was more about Harris undercutting Trump, more so than Harris establishing a firm vision for what exactly her administration would look like. And so for folks who were already sold on Harris, I don't think this necessarily changed much. I think what we're going to see is how resilient is that Trump base? That's the big question for me going forward. Do we see after the debate, is there any change in that sizable fraction of Americans who are just for Trump, period? Was there a little crack in that base for Trump as a result of the debate? And if not, then I think this is just going to be a coin flip election. And so that's something that stood out to me, is we're still very much in a land of uncertainty, and I think there's a lot of space for Harris to try to paint a more specific picture of who she will be if elected president.
I think both candidates were trying to paint a picture of the other one throughout the debate, right? We saw Trump kept talking about Biden. He kept talking about how Harris is related to Biden. Actually, he didn't even say her name, I don't think. We were watching, and I don't think he ever talked about her by name. He kept talking about Biden. He kept saying her, she, whatever. Now, I may be reading too much into it, but I wonder if that is because he's banking on this is kind of her first foray. A lot of people don't know Kamala Harris, and I wonder if him not even deigning to say her name has something to do with banking on that anonymity. He's trying to present her as a non-entity who is just following Biden's established policies, right? Like there's nothing new there. He's talking about how, from a global perspective, people are laughing, people are, don't take them seriously. There's all this weakness that we've discussed that he's trying to position as her narrative. And she, on the other hand, is painting a similar picture in a way where everyone is laughing because he's incoherent, because, he cannot be trusted, and he has no values. I do think, Kevin, you're right that maybe she didn't present the most solid plan about, these are the steps that we're going to take. Although, if we look at the previous election, when Elizabeth Warren kept saying, I have a plan for that, that didn't necessarily win a lot of votes. But she talked about her values a lot. She talked about her values, and he didn't. He wasn't able to articulate, these are the things that I stand for and that are going to color who I hire and what I want for you. Another aspect of this building the narrative for the other was Harris kept talking about all the people that support her and all the people that have called out Trump as a threat. And I think that was also part of this narrative building, where maybe you're not focusing on the policy plan, but you are talking about what you stand for. And so much of that has to do with perception, both domestic, but also international.
So before we move on to this topic, let me pull it back to another sort of meta question here, which I think is interesting, because this is a pretty historical presidential debate, because it may be the last presidential debate between these two candidates, maybe the last presidential debate ever, really, right? Because we saw the breakdown of the Commission for Presidential Debates that had previously organized these things. We saw it really kind of get dragged out between at least these two parties that about whether they were even going to do a debate. Now there's a question as to whether they'll do another one, with the Harris campaign pushing for it and the Trump administration, probably Trump campaign kind of equivocating so far, although maybe that'll change in the next day or two. And that sort of dynamic may yet repeat itself with future candidates, right? It was a big question whether these guys were ever going to agree to a debate, and future candidates may not see it. I guess my question is, from the perspective of national security people who care about the substance of a big part of these issues, and again, an issue that is inherently woven into a lot of these debates about the presidency and a presidential race, do the debates serve a useful function? Are they valuable? Or are they not? Like, is it useful to have people subject to this test? Ben, I'll defer to you, though. You've probably been watching these longest of all of us. Like, what's your sense of that?
I think they're deeply valuable. One of the most valuable things in electoral politics, frankly. For one thing, that at a purely political level, Kamala Harris would not be the nominee today, but for her predecessor's failure at this step. But I mean, steering this a little bit back to the national security components of it, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of, so the headline right now in the New York Times is Harris and Trump bet on their own sharply contrasting views of America. That's the headline, which is really saying the same thing that I was saying before, right? Which is like when they say that, they're not referring to tax policy. They're not referring to, they're referring to these sort of different visions of what constitutes just kind of wildly unacceptable outcomes for America. And I think those are fundamentally national security visions. And it sometimes takes an event like this, a debate like this, to really show the importance of those differences of vision. And I think those visions, sometimes they are primarily domestic visions, like differences, like when Al Gore and George W. Bush. But often, if you go back to big debates, they're about foreign policy. They're not just foreign policy, but they're about, should we have invaded Iraq? One of the fundamental discussions in 2008, between Obama and, Obama was a credible major candidate, partly because he was the person who was willing to say Iraq was a mistake, and I said so from the beginning, and that was something that Hillary Clinton was not really willing to say, that, John Kerry, voted for it before he voted against it, right? And so if you go back to these major debates, they often do turn on sharply competing, sometimes overstatedly competing, different views of America in the world. And I think this is one of them. And those often are more national security visions than the candidates say. I don't know if the words national security were ever spoken in this debate, but I do stand by the idea that, these are different visions of what the security of this country means.
Just to offer one short contrarian take, because it wouldn't be a fun podcast if we didn't have a couple hot takes going in the opposite direction. I'm admittedly a little worried about what we may see if there are future debates, based off of my passionate belief that the medium is the message. And if the indication of candidates using debates for memes and funny Twitter moments and things like that continues to be the norm going forward, then I think we'll lose even more of the substance and only get vibes and just vibes and vibes all the time. And so while I think it was right that people were applauding the Harris campaign for being very strategic in her body language and posturing, if we're just using debates to come up with memeable moments, then I'm not sure they're achieving their potential. So with reforms, I very much agree that debates are incredibly important, can serve a really important role. But if we continue to see debates align more with social media, then I have grave concerns.
I will just say debates will continue. They existed before the Commission on Presidential Debates. They will continue to exist. Don't kid yourself. This will not be the last debate.
I just want to be very briefly contrarian to Kevin's contrarian position. I actually think that there is value to the role that social media can play here. I think a lot of people would not sit down and watch the debate. If I didn't know that I was going to be speaking on rational security about the debate, maybe I don't know that I would have allocated the time for it. And I think those snippets, the little videos, even the, memeable faces, the memeable phrases, all of that allows the discourse of the debate to reach a broader audience. And I think there's value to that. I think that's important. And if people are memeing someone's face, or if they're, if something like, I have the concept of a plan resonates with you, then you're engaging with the issue. And I think the fact that it resonates with us, that it sticks with us, that's important.
And I'll use a moderator's prerogative to add one final point to double down on something Eugenia said. Because I will say this also. The biggest test, I think, of a debate for a candidate is the fact that it's an organizational enterprise that has to use all tools to persuade people to do something for them to vote. That's what being president is. That's what the bully pulpit is. And insofar as social media is part of the new train, part of the thing you have to take account of, you've got to take account of it. So as long as it's staying part of our society, I think making it part of the debate is a good one. The reason the debate's such a good test, because the one time we make candidates sit on a stage on terms that are not entirely their own. And that's what presidents have to do all the time, whether it's with foreign leaders, whether it's pitching domestic legislation, things like that. And the ability to organize, prepare, and do that effectively is actually a good test. It's separate and apart from the substantive part of it, which is itself has its own value.
So now I'm waiting for the meme of Kevin loses debate about the debate.
Oh, contrarian takes. We'll see. Perhaps. I don't know. We don't have our TikTok count up and running yet, but we may yet get Anna on that before the day is done. But let's go on to our second topic now, from one way of persuading voters to another very different way of persuading voters. As I mentioned at the top, we have seen a very busy couple of weeks from the Justice Department, from the Treasury Department as well, involved with some of these actions, where we've seen a wave of enforcement action through a lot of different channels against a variety of sort of influence mechanisms that are being deployed, particularly by the Russians. The biggest parts of it, the parts that stand out to me, is the discovery that there's a shell organization that's been funding a variety of commentators, particularly kind of right-wing, I think fair to say far right wing or more nativist commentators, based in Canada and the United States, but primarily aiming at the United States market in the lead up to the election, sending big chunks of money, surprisingly big chunks of money, to amplify those voices. We've also seen enforcement action taken against Dimitri Simes, a guy who's pretty much a bit of a Washington insider, although a little bit of a weird one those last 10 or 15 years, but a fairly prominent figure who's been a kind of talking head on RT for the last couple of years, and evidently has been doing so in clear violation of sanctions. And we're seeing some clear enforcement action there, although I'll note that it raises some interesting legal questions that we'll have to see spin out as these proceedings go on. Let me start with you on this one, Kevin. What jumps out at you about these enforcement actions? What is really different about what we're seeing in terms of for election interference this time around, and then also the enforcement actions being taken against it?
Yeah, so for me, what really stands out is the scale of the funding and investment in these influencers. So as you were pointing out, Scott, this was not an insubstantial amount of money. I believe in some cases, folks were getting paid upwards of $100,000 for single YouTube episodes. That is not chump change, right? That is something where if you get an email that says, hey, make this content for $100,000, that's a pretty compelling offer for most folks. So that's one thing that really jumps out to me, is just the scale and the level of investment. Number two is what's fascinating about the discourse on disinformation and misinformation has been, we're going to see so much of a creation of AI bots and fake new accounts that are going to spread all this information. And while I think that's very real and there's plenty to talk about in that space, the Russians nevertheless chose to go through known influencers, right? So the power of investing in a single well-known or a couple well-known influencers was apparently the better bet, in their opinion, for getting your message out. And so I think focusing on the role of these influencers and their own networks is going to be a ripe area for continuing study and a potential threat vector with respect to election interference. And so I hope that changes some of the scholarly focus that we've seen, at least with respect to AI, on bots, on agents, on all of these things, to be a little bit more nuanced about just the power of a personality in and of itself to spread and persuade certain communities and individuals. With respect to the enforcement action, I think our own folks at Lawfare, Quinta and Natalie, wrote up an excellent piece detailing why this was a very unique approach to enforcement, where previously we haven't seen this level of specificity in targeting specific individuals and entities. And so for me, I think that shows the seriousness of these threats, as well as the increased capacity of our enforcers to be able to identify and go after these individuals. And so I think that's a positive trend with respect to protecting our elections.
Yeah, so I think Kevin is right that it is really interesting that they're going through existing influencers now that have built-in audiences, and that I think it makes kind of sense, right, without thinking about it too much, that provides an advantage. I'm, however, still not entirely sure that that's the case. Because I remain generally skeptical about the effectiveness of influence operations via social media. I think if we're talking about echo chambers and the actual spread, sometimes we see many of these campaigns, they don't have a lot of engagement, they don't have a lot of spread until we start talking about them as influence operations. But also, I was looking up how many views, right? According to a piece in The Atlantic, the organization that was part of the indictment tenet published about 2,000 YouTube videos, which gained more than 16 million views, roughly 8,000 views per video, right? Now that sounds like a lot. But I looked at the three YouTubers, they have millions of followers, right? There were not millions of people watching these videos. There was, a report as part of the indictment that actually the Russians were a little bit frustrated that they were not getting the traction that they wanted out of the influencers, and because they were more interested in building up their brand and getting the money than actually advancing these positions. So I think that's interesting and important to remember that, we don't really know how effective these things are. We don't know, and then if the millions of people that follow them had watched the video, isn't that still the existing echo chamber? Aren't those their existing audiences? How much is it spreading the message? How much is it convincing new people that they need to change their mind or that these things are true?
Yeah, so I both agree and disagree with the way you're formulating this. So I think one of the striking things is how unimpressive Tenet's own videos are. But the other striking thing is how high profile the people they bought are. And, that's the other side when you say these are influencers with millions of followers. And when you start paying them to toe particular lines, you are actually likely to influence their other writings, speakings, postings. And so one of the things that I would really want to see studied, and I don't think it has been studied yet, was Tenet influencing the direction of the stuff by these people that they were not specifically paying for? In other words, if you pay Tim Pool $400,000 a month or Benny Johnson $100,000 a video, what happens to their other production? And, one thing that I'm interested in is is it that, I can pay Eugenia $100,000 a video and she makes, it turns out it's not her best work because it's, she's just doing it for the money. And so then there's the other Eugenia stuff that's kind of Eugenia. And then there's the video she made for me, which toes, the Russian line, but it's boring and nobody watches it, or only 8,000 people watch it. Or is it, you pay her a lot to make that video, and then her other stuff comes to be a little bit more like that video on the stuff that you care about, because it's a little bit uncomfortable to contradict yourself a lot and to make a video over here that says Russia, 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 and a video over here that says Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. And so you end up buying the mind share of the people that you're influencing. And so it's not really Tenet Media's own production that you should look at. It's kind of what the people who are on their payroll were doing otherwise. And I think that is a kind of methodological question that we need to think about in terms of how we assess these influence operations. And the really good example of this is Tucker Carlson, right? Where, if you think of Tucker Carlson as an independent actor who's just Moscow sympathetic, and so he makes wow videos about Russian supermarkets and Moscow train stations. Then you say, well, okay, so if you pay him $100,000 on the side to make a video, it doesn't really matter much because it's what he's doing anyway. But if you say, hey, there's been a systematic investment in cultivating the pro-Russia components and beliefs of this ecosystem, and slowly but surely, the right has become more and more and more the Trumpist right has become more and more pro-Russia. Then I think you could see these investments as really, really sound and driven by a few key people like Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, who you might not have a financial relationship, but they exercise this kind of gravitational pull on the right in this direction. And then you're just providing seed money for people to go that way. And so I think there's a very deep methodological question that we need to think about in terms of how we study and assess this stuff.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think this should be studied. I, maybe wonder about the causality here. I wonder, I could argue that it is because there's a pre-existing kind of pro-Russia position in the U.S. right that they are able to, approach them, and that they're able to pay them to make these videos. And so there's less influence there. We've seen with other Russian operations, influence operations, that they've tried to play both sides, that they've tried to sow discontent on both the left and the right. And you're not, at least for now, you're not really seeing that with this buying of influencers, where it is, for now, at least, restricted to the right.
Well, let me bring in another aspect of this issue that I think is really interesting, because a challenging aspect of this, particularly if the intended impact is the drift, the center of gravity effect, the not directly funded but autonomous kind of crowd gathering instinct that people have online around ideological views that Ben's kind of channeling as a possibility, at least, although I think we all agree we would need to study it to know if it's there or not. That raises all sorts of weird First Amendment questions, doesn't it? Because a lot of people obviously these people have freedom to express these views and have freedom to do a lot of things that are being done here. The way these enforcement actions are being pursued is through kind of unique channels that are almost unique to the Russian context, right? We now have a very dense network of sanctions against Russia. And so sanctions violations is one major tool. We have installed FARA and kind of expanded on FARA, Federal Foreign Agent Registration Act, requirements that say you have to register if you're acting as an agent of a foreign government. And so that is targeting to the people who are kind of the middlemen, the handlers, acting at the direction of whoever's bankrolling this thing in Russia. But we haven't seen people actually reach the people accepting the money yet. I think that probably has to do with First Amendment reasons. Dimitri Simes, the commentator on RT, is like a one weird example. And I am really curious to see how DOJ argues his prosecution, because he's being charged for sanctions violations, and there is an express statutory carve out for all sorts of informational materials that appearing on TV kind of is. Maybe they're just going to focus on the fact that he was getting paid, but is getting paid providing a service to a sanctioned entity? I'm not sure it is. When the thing you're exchanging it for is outside the scope of the statute. So I'm kind of curious to see how they approach that issue. And I suspect that's part of the reason he got away with it for as long as he did. But it raises these kind of broader questions about, like, where is the right line about chilling these things where it's appropriate, and where do we get too close to the First Amendment? Kevin, you're our resident law professor on this particular conversation, who probably spent more time thinking about this than the rest of us to some extent. What is your sense of that?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating question, in part because this gets at what Ben was probing into as well, which is, did this relationship between Tenet and the influencers actually change the content they were producing? So that's one question. And whether or not that's true, is that a determinative factor when we're thinking about the criminality of this, or what sort of response we can take? Because in preparation for Rational Security, I listened to some diverse podcasts hitting on coverage of election interference, and folks who I would venture to guess are regular listeners to those influencers had a very different interpretation of this enforcement action, and chalked it up more or less to criminalizing anyone who has a pro-Russia view. And so all of a sudden, if you see that discourse spreading of, oh, okay, now any policy position that doesn't align with whatever the governmental authority is at hand is suddenly going to be quashed in some regard, even if it's in an indirect fashion, well, that raises a lot of red flags just from that chilling perspective. And I think that's a debate we need to have, is how do you say that merely puppeting certain views, even if they're views you hold yourself, even if you receive financial compensation to amplify those messages, is that something that should be sanctioned? That's a really fascinating conversation. And I also think that, to Eugenia's point, studying what qualifies as election interference is also a really important topic, because you can make a pretty compelling argument that by virtue of bringing this enforcement action, 57 days before the election, we're perpetuating the sort of distrust in the election itself. And we're sowing the seeds of either side potentially being able to say, oh, this wasn't a rigorous election, or this wasn't a fair election. But to Eugenia's point, 8,000 people watched these episodes, and they were 8,000 people that were probably going to watch those episodes to begin with. And so how we draw a line, even with respect to what qualifies as election interference, is another really difficult question. And I think this is a question that's flummoxed law professors for quite a while, is trying to say what sort of behavior actually qualifies as election interference, because taken in a really broad sense, you could say campaigning is election interference, right? Just the mere act of trying to sway voters is election interference, obviously. So figuring out where you draw the line between that sort of normal campaigning to a YouTuber who is going to share a message anyway, to now a YouTuber who just is even more likely to share that message because they receive funding from a domestic or foreign source, really muddles the question, and I think is going to be an ongoing question as we see more folks try to use these influencers in ways to amplify their messages.
So before we break on this topic, I want to turn our attention to the other side of the equation, this enforcement action. That's the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, the U.S. government. This strikes me as a pretty notable action in a lot of ways. We are now less than 60 days out from a presidential election, and this is enforcement action not directly related to a candidate, not the sort of thing that DOJ policies would prohibit in any way, but nonetheless, it's a sensitive period. And I don't think DOJ or other government officials are unaware of the fact that it's a sensitive period, and that this is activity that you do not have to read too far between the lines to understand is primarily designed to benefit one presidential candidate, the former President Trump, and kind of his ideological fellow travelers. How does that enter in, or should that enter in here? It strikes me that there's kind of a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, you run the risk of being perceived as doing something that is politically intended to have a political effect if you're taking action like this less than 60 days outside of election or too close to an election, whatever that line might be. On the flip side, though, insofar as this is intended to have a deterrent effect, intended to affect a lot of people and inhibit a lot of operations beyond the ones you're enforcing or targeting and shutting down, but a bunch of other ones you can't yet reach, 60 days before the election is the period where you want to have that deterrent effect the most of all, where it might be most influential and more impactful. Ben, you know DOJ like few other people. You understand their logic, their thinking around these sorts of enforcement activities. What's your read on this? The timing of this just struck me as really interesting, particularly it's so clearly deliberate because so many of these things are happening in such a tight period. How do they weigh these different equities? What do you think drove them to do that?
Yeah, so I think the 60-day period operates exactly the opposite of the fashion that the invocation of the policy implies here. So the policy, to the extent that it is a policy at all, involves overt law enforcement steps against named political candidates on a ballot. So that would imply you don't do something, you don't there won't be a search warrant executed against Donald Trump or Kamala Harris in the window. There won't be an indictment brought. It does not affect things against third parties who might be trying to interfere in the election. And I think one of the things that happened in 2016 was that a reticence about doing things in public for fear of interfering with the election caused the Justice Department not to acknowledge that, for example, the Russia investigation existed, caused months of discussion about whether there should be a naming Russia as the actor behind the DNC hacks and whether there should be any discussion or acknowledgement of what the Russian objective was, right? And that the administration, the IC, it was more the IC really than the Justice Department, but part of the IC is the FBI, which is a component of the Justice Department, or at least on the intelligence side. And so, they really tied themselves in knots regarding what they could or should or would say, and not really because of the window per se, just because of a concern about being seen to be involved in the in the election in some sense. Well, of course, they have learned that lesson, and I think you should understand this as lessons learned. They are being active in the immediate period of the election to deter, as you suggested, to stop activity that is interfering in some meaningful way. And actually, I think they are doing stuff in order to out foreign actors that are improperly getting involved in U.S. elections. And so I think the better way to understand it with reference to the timing of the election is, yes, they are doing this now because there is an election whose integrity they are trying to protect.
Well, let us go from one historic event to another one whose shadow really hangs over a lot of the topic we've even been discussing in this episode today in a lot of ways, even 20 years after the fact. And that is the fact that we are recording this on the 23rd anniversary, of the 9/11 attacks on September 11th. I think it'll be released the day after. This is always an anniversary that I think weighs heavily in lots of people's minds. Never forget is the theme, the repeated phrase so often about 9/11. And for a lot of people, including me, who was a high school senior when 9/11 happened in the DC area and knew people very directly affected by it, it really does still resonate emotionally, psychologically as a major event with major ramifications. But we're in this odd moment where people not only don't seem driven by the same issue set, the same kind of worldview that emerged from 9/11. We don't see terrorism appearing very prominently, frankly, on the most recent national security strategy released by the Biden administration at all. Shockingly little, actually. We don't hear it discussed a lot. We see a very conscious effort to move past the Afghanistan and Iraq military operations. To some extent, not successfully. That was something that came up repeatedly at the debate last night. But nonetheless, I think the general tenor has been, how do we move past? We need to put that chapter behind us. And it really strikes me, and struck me more this year than it has in prior recent years, that in a lot of ways we've moved past big aspects of what was the 9/11 legacy from a policy perspective, from a national politics perspective. But there are certain threads that strike me as kind of remaining, that I think are worth dwelling on. Ben, I want to start with you on this one, as I think in a lot of ways your professional trajectory was affected very directly by 9/11 and its aftermath in a way as much as mine, maybe perhaps even more so than mine, in a lot of ways, because of where you are in your career and what you've ended up doing, becoming a national security expert, which really was in response to covering a lot of the things that came after 9/11, I think it's fair to say. So what do you take away? What is the big legacy of 9/11 today that we're living with? How do we think of it differently now than we did 10 years ago?
Well, I mean, I don't think there is a big legacy. There are many big legacies. And I want to start with the one that nobody talks about, which is that, and it's one of unbelievable success, which is that the United States has not had a major terrorist attack on its soil, and relatively few actually directed against its instrumentalities or personnel overseas since 9/11. We hardened a lot of targets. We went after a lot of bad guys, both in the criminal justice process and in by other means. And we functionally destroyed Al-Qaeda as a operating organization. And we made a lot of places in the world safer for Americans and for non-Americans, actually. And, you know, if you had told me or a huge number of other people within the year of 9/11 that there was no second day attack, we would stop them all, that would have been mind-boggling. We all thought this was the beginning of something, and it was not the beginning of something because Al-Qaeda didn't want it to be, because there were other terrorist groups that were going to try. This was a major policy success, and it's one that people have largely forgotten about because things that don't happen don't make much of an impression. It is also a policy success that led to all kinds of other policy failures. And so the most prominent of them, of course, is Iraq, which, Scott, you know more about than I do. And look, I mean, that's I don't know very many people who in retrospect think that was a good idea. Afghanistan is a much more complicated proposition because it's related to the policy success. And so a lot of what we managed to do in Afghanistan was, in the short and medium term, very good and very effective. And there is a generation of women who grew up in Afghanistan with opportunities to do things like education that did not exist before and did not exist after. And so I actually think Afghanistan is a very mixed proposition, but it ultimately ended in failure. And then there are the very profound legal changes that happened in the U.S. legal system, in the international legal system, as a result of 9/11. And so I think all of these are legacies. They are legacies that have to be evaluated, I think, individually as well as in combination with each other. Some of them are disastrous. Some of them are hugely valuable and important. And I don't think there is a single legacy of, by the way, just as there is no single legacy of World War II, right? I mean, we like to tell a neat story about World War II where, you know, we got attacked and we defeated Germany and Japan and we built democracies there. But, you know, there are these other legacies of World War II that are different, you know, the internment of Japanese Americans, for example. You know, one that I've learned about recently, you know, the destruction of large numbers of Pacific Island communities more as a result of U.S.-Japanese combat than as a result of anything intentional on anybody's part. But these are huge legacies that are not simply in the easily categorizable within the sort of overall legacy. And I think, 9/11 is one of those cosmically big events in American history that doesn't have a simple legacy. It has 100 different legacies. I first was able to go back to Lower Manhattan, or to that, to ground zero area of Lower Manhattan. I was not emotionally ready to do it for 20 years. And I finally did it, I guess about 2 years ago, when Ken Weinstein, who's the undersecretary of DHS for intelligence, who had asked me to be on an advisory panel, invited the members of the advisory panel to an event that was taking place at Ground Zero at the memorial. And that was the first time I'd been back to the World Trade Center site since 9/11. And so, for those of us who lived through it as adult professionals, as people who knew people who were killed there, as people whose professional lives or otherwise lives were just completely changed by it. And I am certainly one of those people. It's just hard to overstate the impact of so many different aspects of it on all of us. And, so I don't want to tell you what the legacy was. I can tell you 100 stories about 100 legacies, some good, some that I'm very, very proud of, and some that I'm ashamed of, and some that I think were extremely well-intentioned, good attempts at serious moral things that failed. And I will give only one anecdote to tie this all together, which is that shortly after 9/11, there was, of course, the anthrax attacks, which everybody understood were an Al-Qaeda operation, of course, and of course turned out not to be. But there was another event that happened, I think, concurrently with the anthrax attacks, so sort of like a month or 2 months after 9/11, which nobody remembers, which is that there was a plane crash in Queens, I believe near Kennedy Airport, a flight, I believe, from Puerto Rico, fell out of the sky into a residential neighborhood in Queens. And we all knew this was the next Al-Qaeda attack. And it turned out to be a plane that fell out of the sky for no reason at all into a residential neighborhood. It was not a terrorist attack. And I remember, like, a bunch of people were killed. I can't remember the numbers, but it was a lot of people. It was a real air disaster. And I can't describe the feeling of relief when I realized, oh, it's just a plane crash. And, we don't have to think about what it means or who did it, or it's just a disaster that killed a lot of people, and we don't have to have a war. And that was the period after 9/11 when a horrible plane crash that killed a lot of people could be just a plane crash. And by the way, we could all forget about it, and we have all forgotten about it.
So, Kevin, Eugenia, you're in kind of a unique position in that you are, I think, I'm not sure exactly how old either of you are, but I believe you're a bit younger than I am. And so weren't adults when this happened. I was kind of on the cusp of adulthood, but I think you all had a little bit of a distance from it, and it came up in a way, a kind of post 9/11 world, at least. I mean, my sense of your formative professional careers is probably more than 10 years after 9/11. What is your sense of that legacy, and what parts of it really carry with you today? Because I suspect it's very different if you didn't live through it in its immediacy in the same way.
Yeah, I think to echo Ben's emphasis on there are 100, if not 100,000 different legacies, and one factor into the myriad legacies that exist is, in my opinion, geography and generational differences. So geographically, I was in elementary school in Portland, Oregon. Portland is pretty dang far from New York, and I didn't have a lot of folks in good old Beaverton, Oregon, who were necessarily that connected to Manhattan. And very few people I knew necessarily even had somebody who was a relative of a relative's relative who was involved. There just weren't that many connections between Portland and New York City. And so I think that was one defining attribute where in many ways it did just feel like something bad happened on TV. And generationally, Ben's story or mention of the anthrax attacks, the legacy for me was that year for trick-or-treating sucked. Why? Because my parents were so scared that somebody had laced my candy with anthrax. And so I remember that Halloween was the worst ever because we had to, really verify that somebody hadn't injected something or laced something. And so that was a bad Halloween. And that in and of itself just shows how different the experiences were. And so it has been something, though, I'd say as a millennial, 9/11 cannot be talked about without thinking about the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And for millennials, for me, it really marked this sense of optimism. Like I still remember in the dawn of the new millennium, being in Seattle, everyone was wearing patriotic gear. Everyone was celebrating America and rah, rah, rah. And then it felt like the rest of my childhood and into my teenage years, there was a shift into how we perceived ourselves as the good guys on the national scale. And you could sense it from your teachers, you could sense it from your colleagues, your parents. Suddenly there was a lot more skepticism about what is it that qualifies America? What is it that makes us so excited to be American? And I think that's an ongoing question that a lot of millennials really struggle with is how much do I want to hitch my horse? How much do I want to identify when I go to London, when I go to Paris, when I go on that random exchange trip as an American? And I don't think that was a question that our older siblings had to ask or a lot of other folks had to ask. And that struggle with the American identity is something that stands out. And I see that the legacy of 9/11 will continue to morph because as a constitutional law professor, I teach a case, Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, which involves a U.S. citizen being taken as an enemy combatant in Afghanistan. And a lot of my Gen Z students, when I say, hey, tell me a little bit more about 9/11, there's not a whole lot of robust hand raising. And I don't know if that's for lack of knowledge or for lack of willingness to talk about it or a combination of the two of them. But the folks who experienced 9/11 in some capacity, in some meaningful capacity, and the folks who didn't, the folks who just read about it or see it on TV, is a very different set of individuals. And I think it is important to go. I would love if more Americans went down to Lower Manhattan because I do think one of the most powerful memorials maybe I've ever been to is the 9/11 memorial. The excellence of forcing you to confront the absence of something is really beautiful and very, very emotional. And more Americans should go down there if they have the opportunity, the means, and the time and see what it really means to lose that many folks. And one other note that I'll just flag that I hope gets written into the history books was how much we relied on a very small number of Americans to fight on our behalf for many, many years. This voluntary force, you hear stories of folks with members in the armed forces, their families, they can tell you horror stories about the number of times individuals were deployed, redeployed, and then redeployed because of this voluntary force. And that part of the story, I think, often gets neglected because if you are on the coast, if you're on the Acela Corridor or along I-5, you don't meet a lot of former members of the military. Generally, you meet a lower percentage of people who have served. But if you go to the heartland and talk about Iraq and talk about Afghanistan and talk about what it meant to serve during that period, it was a tremendously scarring event for a lot of families. And so I think that needs to be written into the history books and paid a lot more attention to.
I don't have a lot that's new to add. I think my story, or my perception of 9/11 is very similar to what Kevin just explained, right? I was 8 years old when this happened. And I was quite far away. I was further than Portland, Oregon. And still I remember it, I remember going to school and having this feeling that people were talking about it. Something had happened, something like big and important and really bad had happened in the world. And I'm sure that I went back to, worrying about whatever third grade drama was going on, but that's a memory that I still carry. I remember that day in a way that I don't remember many other days. So I think that speaks to the significance that this had and the reverberations that it had across the world. Similar to what Kevin just said, though, not having actually lived through it, and most of my growing up in a post 9/11 world, there is a lot of a perception of, in ways, a double standard and skepticism of some of the narratives about the role that the United States plays in the world and it wants to play in the world that still color the way that I look at the way that, policies are presented and how they're carried out. And I think that's something that I still carry with me today in the way that I look at issues that are maybe less connected, like cybersecurity, which is what I focus on. I'm a student of international law, and many of the questions about, whether the US was actually following what it wants others to follow are real questions, and they're still there. And in terms of a personal legacy, maybe that's something that has stayed with me.
I should correct something that I said earlier about American Airlines Flight 587, which in fact did crash into Queens, killing more than 200 people on board and 5 on the ground, and turns out to be the second most deadly U.S. air disaster ever, at least of the accidental variety, and is forgotten as a result of having happened 2 months after 9/11 and having been determined to be an accident, as I said, but was not coming from Puerto Rico. It was coming from the Dominican Republic. And that is precisely the kind of thing that is very easy to forget about it because we don't remember anything about it because Al-Qaeda didn't do it.
Well, on that somewhat somber note, we are out of time for today. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Yes, even RatSec 2.1, we're sticking with the object lessons. Kevin, what do you have to share with us this week?
Yeah, so as I hinted at in my earlier remarks, you all have to go read Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. It is one of the best reads, one of the quickest reads, but one of the reads that will stick with you. This book really looks at how cable news changed politics in America and changed political discourse in America. And you'll read it and you'll think, oh my gosh, this man, Postman, was so accurate about how we would see cable news transform the quality of our discourse as a result of what you had to do to share a message on TV, right? You had to present things differently. You had to speak differently. And so as a result, our politics changed and our discourse changed. And when you apply those messages and those themes to the internet, to blogging, to Instagram, now to TikTok, and you see this notion of the medium is the message, well, things get a little bleak, in my opinion, because you realize that the quality of the discourse that's possible, in my opinion, on a platform like TikTok does not bode well for the future of American deliberative democracy. So I encourage everyone to go read Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and then go watch something fun, because you'll be quite depressed after that. But that's my recommendation.
Ben, what do you have to share with us this week?
I want to share my absolute favorite movie about 9/11, which is a movie, a documentary entitled Man on Wire, because it is not about 9/11 at all. It is about, in fact, the fate of the World Trade Center. What happened on 9/11 is never discussed or talked about or depicted in the movie, which is a documentary about a weird little group of misfits in 1973 around a prankster, a very talented prankster named Philippe Petit, who had a scheme to run a high wire between the towers of the not yet finished World Trade Center building and to walk between and dance between the towers on this high wire on what was then the two tallest buildings in the world. This was something that happened when I was a small child, and Philippe Petit was prosecuted and sentenced to do a high wire performance act in Central Park, which he did. And the movie lovingly reconstructs what was, I think, the greatest troll in the history of the world. The film, and I say that as a connoisseur of trolling, and the greatest scene in it, other than the footage of him up there, more than 1,000 feet in the air on a wire, is the NYPD press conference about what was happening. They did a real-time press conference. And if you have never seen Man on Wire, it is a thing of beauty.
I have seen it. It's a wonderful movie. I strongly second that recommendation. For my object lesson this week, I will dip back into the long neglected files of Scott going to concerts, because I finally got to go to a concert again after the birth of my second child. My wife and I went to celebrate our anniversary last Friday. A phenomenal show at a venue that I will recommend to anyone in the DC area or the broader surrounds or who's passing through town. That is Wolf Trap. Underappreciated, out in the Virginia suburb, but an absolutely beautiful, gorgeous outdoor venue that was particularly relevant for this particular show because the artist Waxahachie, who I think I previously mentioned was my artist and song of the summer with her song Right Back to It, actually mentioned a show, which I didn't realize she actually wrote that song backstage at Wolf Trap the last time she was touring there. So it has a particular relevance, which is really exceptional. And she spoke really glowingly as she gave a just absolutely phenomenal performance, one of the best live shows I've seen in a long time. So it's a triple endorsement to Right Back to It, Waxahachie, doubling down on those from a few weeks ago, and then to Wolf Trap. All around a magical evening. Recommend it for folks in DC area to check it out. Eugenia, bring us home. What do you have for your object lesson?
So as part of RatSec 2.1, I'm actually departing from my video game recommendations because I've been coming on so much that I don't have any.
We're going to have to call this 2.2 now, I feel like.
No, I don't have new games to talk about because, I come on so often now. So I've had to look at other things that I do. And I actually want to recommend a documentary on National Geographic. It's called Ocean Explorers. And it is, I think, produced by James Cameron. And it follows Ocean Explorer. It's a gigantic ship that explores the oceans, and it's state of the art. It has amazing new technology, and basically every episode it's them getting never before seen footage about amazing creatures, advancing our understanding of the world and the creatures that live in it. I'm in awe at everything. It's beautiful. It's interesting. And I think it really shows a really good use of technology. We spend so much time talking about the dangers. I'm just encouraged by watching a show that focuses so much on the benefit to science of the incredible things that we have now at our disposal.
This is the one show that might get me over my very instinctual aversion to anything involving just using the letter X in place of actual words, which this does. It's just the letter Explorer. If it's not a team of mutants fighting other teams of evil mutants, I'm not interested usually, but I will make an exception for this one because I think it looks pretty cool.
It is really good.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X, but not the Explorers, the different X. And I object to this one in most grounds, at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha. On behalf of Ben, Eugenia, and Kevin, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.